Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I hope you are safe at home, and I'm glad that you guys have been attending all our, lecture series. Today, we have Professor Kinshuk with us. So, Professor Kinshuk Jha is an associate professor and assistant director at Center for Comparative and International Taxation and Center for International Trade and Economic Law at Jindal Global Law School. Professor, we welcome you today for this webinar. Thank you for joining us. Also, I would like to inform all the attendees that after the session, we would take your questions. So you can definitely write the questions and I'll be moderating the sessions. Thank you so much for joining us today. Professor, now you can continue with your session. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Anshu. Thank you for your introduction. And thank you for just introducing the topic as well a bit, at least the title of it. So before I proceed, I also hope that all of you are doing well wherever you are and your near and dear ones are fine. And coming to the topic now, I'll be addressing the issue of taxpayer rights, and particularly from a direct tax perspective, how exactly it has evolved over the period of time, right from the first Income Tax Act which India saw in 1860 till the contemporary times. And to take me through this journey, I'll give you just some insights into how exactly the statutes were at different points of time, what were the roles of different administrative committees, what were the roles of maybe different court of law at different points of time, the constitutional provisions which come into the aid and rescue of taxpayers at times, and also any and other sort of, administrative mechanisms which are in place to redress the issues, to avoid the issues, to avoid the altercations between income tax department and that of taxpayers. Before I begin my talk, I just would like to quote Mr. Nani Palkhiwala, who undoubtedly is our leading tax jurist. Mr. Palkhiwala had something very critical to say about the status of taxes in India, and not just in India. In fact, this particular quotation of his is equally applicable in all jurisdictions. But then this reflected a very, I would say, balanced sentiment as far as the issue of rights versus obligation is concerned in the domain of taxes. So in his words, taxes are the lifeblood of any government, but it cannot be overemphasized that the blood is taken from the arteries of the taxpayers, and therefore the transfusion has to be accomplished with the principles of justice and fair play. Now, needless to say, this particular quotation is keeping in mind the balance which needs to be struck between the tax collection functions and at the same time the taxpayers side of things are concerned. Keeping this as the principal theme in mind, keeping this in mind as the principal theme for this evening, let's have a look into how exactly the income tax or the direct tax based taxpayer rights domain in India has progressed right from the first enactment itself. So which is where I would like you to introduce to the first income tax enactment which India ever saw. That was in the British era, needless to say, and that was in the year of 1860. Now, all of you must be aware that 1857 was a pivotal point as far as India's struggles were concerned during the colonial roots, and there was a huge amount of, I would say, unrest. There was a revolution, and because of which the rule of the Indian jurisdiction, I would say, it transferred from the East India Corporation to the British government, the British monarchy. And at that point of time, in 1860, for the first time, there was an Income Tax Act introduced in India, and the person who framed it, the person who drafted it, was known by the name of Mr. James Wilson. Now, Wilson, when he introduced this set of income tax in India, or income tax provisions in India, of course, the revenue maximization was the key criteria. It was the principal objective behind such an introduction of a statute. And in order to achieve the revenue maximization functions, there were some blatant denials as far as the taxpayer rights were concerned. To be realistic, in that era, in that century, I mean, even in the British jurisdiction, even in England, even in United States, the amount of taxpayer rights which were available were quite limited, simply because of the reason that laws were evolving and they were at a very nascent stage at that point of time. In UK, the first set of income tax act was introduced somewhere around at the beginning of the 19th century, and India followed suit hardly 40, 50 years later. So you can safely say that uh, because there was hardly any experience or limited experience of income tax administration in the hands of Britishers, uh, there were certain challenges, there were certain teething problems as far as its introduction in the Indian scenario was concerned. Of course, the geography, the economic situation, the political sentiments over here, everything were different. And because of which, there were some issues, some major issues as far as 1860s Acts was concerned. Now, from a taxpayer rights perspective, what all rights were there in the initial act? I would say hardly any, because as I mentioned a while back, that the bulk of the focus was on revenue maximization. But because of this, there were certain arbitrary powers which were granted in favor of the assessing officers or the collectors at that point of time. The collectors, they had powers to do summary assessments. They had random powers, or rather, they had powers to conduct random search and seizures. The concept of self-assessment was something entirely new for the Indian masses because they were not used to this kind of a system, though it was already being practiced in the British jurisdiction, but then in India it was a novel introduction altogether. And the gravity of the problem was so high that at a point of time it was realized that almost 96% of assessments which were being filed or which were being conducted, they needed to be scrutinized to establish their legitimacy. Now, this in itself was a major administrative problem, and it also indicated the plight on the side of taxpayers. So, needless to say, even though this 1860 statute seemed to be ambitious, it seemed to be favorable for the government, but in reality, what it actually ended up doing was hardly any tax collections, hardly any revenue generation. And because of which, in 1863, it was scrapped, a new statute was introduced. And between 1863 to 1886, I would say, there was a sort of a status quo which was maintained, but for a single major difference which was brought into place. In the statute of 1860, the first statute itself, agriculture, probably for the only time in the history of Indian income taxes, was made as a taxable entity. So agricultural income was made taxable in the very first statute, which was Income Tax Act of 1860. But as I said, there were some huge administrative challenges as far as uh, maximum revenue generation or even optimum revenue generation from this particular statute was concerned. As far as the public sentiment was concerned, since India was primarily an agrarian society, majority of the Indians, they were involved in agrarian activities at that point of time. Of course, taxing agricultural activities was a huge, I would say, it was a huge point to discourage the masses as far as filing their income taxes were concerned. So, uh, consequently, in 1863, this income tax imposition on agricultural income or agricultural activities was dropped altogether, and it was never introduced back as far as the Income Tax Act is concerned. So that was one of the major takeaways of 1863's statute. Uh, Certain rights, as far as some sort of a appeal, some sort of a hearing, certain principles of natural justice, they were introduced at this stage, which were properly affirmed, I would say, which were properly put into place only in the Act of 1886, which is where for the first time it was defined that what exactly, for example, the activity of agriculture is. what exactly is the amount of exemption or amount of benefits which might be given to an agriculturalist. So all these concepts, all these fundamentals were first identified, first established in the Statute of 1886. Certain other critical features, for example, the kind of persons which India had. As we see today, under Section 14 of the Income Tax Act, we have 5 types of persons, or more than 5 actually, where all sorts of, you would say, natural person, juridical person, everyone is covered in the ambit of definition of person. Now, for the first time ever, Hindu undivided families, they were divided, they were identified rather, or Hindu undivided family was identified as a taxable unit in the enactment of 1886. This further marked a significant improvement as far as tax administration in India is concerned. Because HUF, needless to say, is an entity unique to the territory of India, and the tax treatment of it, given the joint family structure, more so in the erstwhile era, uh, it had to be considered in a holistic way, and because of which the Hindu undivided family concept as a person was absolutely essential to be put into place. And that's what was precisely achieved in the 1886 Act. Moving beyond, there were certain more developments, gradual developments, as far as the overall income tax landscape, the administrative landscape in the Indian jurisdiction was concerned. By 1916, there was an introduction for the first time again under the British era of a progressive system of taxation. There were rates which were introduced as per the income earning capacity of individuals and different entities. So you could say that in a way this laid the foundation to the slab rate structure which we still have in the Income Tax Act. Around this time only, during the period of 1916, I should say at the beginning of 1918, somewhere around that point of time, we had the, I mean, globally there was an issue of First World War. There was an event of First World War, right from 1918 to some years onwards, and which is where the government for the first time, they introduced the concept of super rich tax. Yeah. So, which is where we should keep in mind that all these concepts, which seem to be sort of arbitrary, which seem to be sort of troublesome to us today, they are not all novel inventions. They have some roots, some origins in the pre-independence era as well. So the super rich tax was introduced as a concept somewhere around, I would say, 1918, 1990. And during that period of time, it was realized that though these new forms of taxes are there, there have to be some sort of administrative measures, also some sort of administrative improvements as well. Because of which, appellate mechanisms, they were introduced, and in the same light, a significant statute which was introduced was the Statute of 1939, the Income Tax Act of 1939. Over there, for the first time, based upon the recommendations or rather the assessment of 1939 enactment and based on the recommendations of a tax administration reform committee which was set up in 1936, there were certain appellate mechanisms which were further strengthened. For example, Income Tax Appellate Tribunal that was created for the first time in the year of 1941. This was based again on a scrutiny of the 1939 Act as well as the recommendations of the 1936 Committee on Tax Reform Administration or Tax Administration Reform. So we can say, I mean, this is just a very brief overview of how exactly things were in the British era, right from uh, random search and seizure powers, right from a certain arbitrary powers as far as the scrutiny of assessments was concerned, the reopening of assessments was concerned. In fact, in the very first act between 1860 to 1886, that's where the most amount of discrimination that happened as far as native taxpayers and non-resident taxpayers were concerned. To give you an example, uh, the Europeans at that point of time, the European taxpayers rather, at that point of time, they would avail different forums of appeal. They had access to different forums of appeal as against the forums or the choice of forums which Indians have. Also, uh, the sort of penalty provisions which would be applicable in case of a non-resident taxpayer would be very different from the penalty provisions which would be applicable in case of a native taxpayer. So right from these racial undertoned or based on racial discrimination sort of tax administration principles which the early statutes had, we finally were able to arrive at a point in the British era itself by, I would say, the year of 1939, 1940s, early 1940s, that we had a proper income tax appellate tribunal, we had a proper income tax appellate mechanism in place, which was uniformly available to resident as well as non-resident taxpayers. Keep in mind, of course, by this point of time, and in fact, after the era of 1860s itself, I would say, the discrimination part was also out of the window. The treatment of taxpayers was equal, as I just mentioned. It was equal in the hands of residents as well as non-residents. Now, I mentioned the role of 1936 Tax Administration Reform Committee. Let me tell you a bit more about the role of administrative committees as far as India's income tax jurisprudence, and in the same context, the taxpayer rights, how they have helped to create the structure. uh, so let me elaborate on that. I gave you the example of 1936 Tax Administration Reform Committee. In the independent era, or I would say the post-independence era of India, post 1947, the Law Commission, it examined the Income Tax Act of 1939, which was the prevailing income tax act at the time of independence. It examined the provisions of 1939's Income Tax Act. It stated that there were certain changes which were required. There were still certain arbitrary taxes which were, or certain arbitrary procedures rather, which were in place. There were certain provisions which were not really certain, which were not really fair, and I mean they had to be considered from a taxpayer's perspective. And of course, overall collection, overall revenue generation of taxes, that also had to be improved. That was ultimately the goal of, I would say, any tax reform committee. So, based on the recommendations of Law Commission in 1958, there was a tax administration reform committee which was set up, and they sort of had a consultative process with the concerned stakeholders. They invited inputs from the public, from civil society groups, and based on these inputs, we had a novel income tax structure in the form of Income Tax Act of 1961. Now, because of this Income Tax Act of 1961, there should have been lesser issues, there should have been lesser hassles for the taxpayer as well as the administration. But unfortunately, that was not to be. The major reason behind this was still the very high rates of taxes which were prevailing, and not just that, but also certain administrative procedures which were quite complicated, certain, I would say, compliance provisions and penalty provisions on the taxpayer sides which were quite complicated, and because of which, of course, there were certain, I would say, loopholes in the system, and overall tax collection, it did got impaired. Considering this, in the 1960s or early half of 1970s, you could say, there was another committee which was set up, and this was known as the Wangchu Committee, where what was identified as a probable cause for such issues was that the issue of non-compliance on the part of taxpayers was causing low collection of taxes in the hands of tax administrators. But the interesting bit over here was that why such non-compliance was in place, that was totally ignored. Even though it might have been considered in the report, it was not submitted in the final report which was provided to the government. So the reason behind such non-compliance, the reason behind such, I would say, low generation of taxes were primarily the amount of taxes which were extortionary in nature, which were considered extortionary in nature, which were a huge deterrent to any business, to individuals, and also the compliances still being very cumbersome, the penalty provisions still being very cumbersome, all of which, though was studied, was not recommended as amendments in the forthcoming income tax provisions. So this sort of a mechanism, it continued, I would say, till the early 90s. There were certain changes here and there. There were definitely certain improvements in tax administration here and there. But during the period of early 90s, when we arrived in the era of liberalization, privatization, globalization, and especially when India was facing a balance of payment crisis, uh, it was a very tactical move. It was a very, I would say, uh, futuristic move by the erstwhile government. The amount of introductions which they brought in, as far as the financial markets were concerned, and also the amount of tax amendments which they went ahead with. In the same era, between 60s or you should say between 70s to early 90s, there were a lot of double taxation avoidance agreements also which were entered into by the Indian government with certain other sovereigns. Of course, you would be understanding the nature of a DTA. It would be a bilateral arrangement. So it would be between the government of India and certain other sovereign. So these policy uh, norms or these policy, I would say, changes which were introduced, it led to a re-examination of the provisions of Income Tax Act of 1961. And needless to say, all of you must be aware that the Income Tax Act of 1961, though it's the principal statute, every year we have a Finance Act which brings in the necessary amendments. And it acts in supplement with the principal statute, which is that of Income Tax Act of 1961. So in the early 90s, we had Dr. Raja Chalaya Committee that was set up. And Dr. Raja Chalaya Committee, in fact, is hailed, or Dr. Raja Chalaya himself is hailed as the father of income tax reforms in India, income tax administration reforms in India. Because what he realized in his report and in his submissions was that there were a lot of extortionary taxes even at that point of time. The primary aim of the tax collectors till that point of time appeared to be focusing more on revenue generation and less on taxpayer facilitation. This attitude, there was a paradigm shift in it, and eventually the Indian government, it brought in a slew of changes, and because of which you would say that in the early 2000s, we arrived at a stage where for the first time we started recognizing as a tax administration the importance of uh, service over enforcement. So this was a paradigm shift. Till this point of time, the income tax administration in India was an enforcement based mechanism. But from the early 2000 onwards, you can say that it went into a domain of service provision to the taxpayers, okay, to facilitate the cause of taxpayers. Of course, any mischief, any misconduct, that would still not be tolerated, but to the genuine taxpayers, maximum amount of facilitation would be extended, maximum amount of, you would say, encouragement and certain ease in compliance, they would be extended. Now, while all this was happening, there was an issue identified globally, that of base erosion and profit shifting. Now, of course, the BEPS action plan, if you have heard of it, that emerged as an action plan in the hands of OECD in 2015. But the concerns, or I would say the issues around base erosion and profit shifting, they had started emerging a few decades before. And that's why those issues, they were identified, and ultimately an attempt was made to address those issues in the form of BEPS 2015. But why I'm bringing this in right now is because after all the changes which were introduced in the form of Raja Chalaya Committee's recommendations, India was steadily moving ahead. But at the same time, globally, it was recognized that there was a lot of abusive tax avoidance which had started emerging. And at the same time, in India, we had the very famous Vodafone case. Now, some tax scholars, they can easily divide the Indian tax jurisprudence in a pre-Vodafone era and a post-Vodafone era. So that should highlight the importance of the Vodafone judgment, and which is where in 2012, the Indian government, after the Supreme Court of India, it delivered a judgment against the revenue authorities as far as the Vodafone case was concerned. They simply went ahead and introduced a retrospective set of amendments in the Indian Income Tax Act. The effect of these retrospective amendments were just not, limited to bringing the Vodafone's transactions within the tax net, but they shook the investor sentiments to a great extent. In the same light, when the government of India realized that some damage control needs to be done because a lot of FIIs, a lot of, I would say, foreign investors in the Indian markets, they started pulling out their capital, their wealth from the Indian market. That's where the Indian government, they set up a particular committee by the name of Tax Administration Reform Committee, the TARC committee as we call it, under the leadership of Dr. Parthasarathi Shome. Now, Dr. Parthasarathi Shome's Tax Administration Reform Committee, TARC committee, it came up with certain recommendations. The first one of which was that there should be an immediate halt to retrospective amendments unless such a retrospective amendment is beneficial to the cause of the taxpayer or it is neutral to the cause of the taxpayer. So long as it is harmful, it should be avoided as a principle. Now, just to update you, till date, though there have not been, I would say, certain major retrospective amendments in the recent past, but the Indian government has not said an absolute no to the retrospective position which we have as far as Income Tax Act is concerned. We'll come back to that at the end of or at the conclusion of my talk. But for now, just keep in mind that the TARC committee, it came up with various administrative proposals and changes. It really worked on enhancing, it really worked on recommending the enhancement of taxpayer rights in India, or in other ways, in another way you could say that the taxpayer services which the Income Tax Department was delivering at that point of time, they were deemed insufficient, and which is where one of the recommendations of the TARC committee was that at least 10% of the total revenue collection should be dedicated towards taxpayer services. The logic was simple, that if you are investing in your taxpayers, if you're investing in educating them, if you are investing in granting them ease of access, if you're investing creating a better compliance mechanism, a better harmonious relationship all in all between the taxpayer and the tax collector, then of course the revenue generations will be on the higher side as well. Now, these are the recommendations of the TARC committee at that point of time, some of which have been implemented, some of which still have to see the light of the day. Some of the critical ones I have already mentioned about. One more I would like to specify on is that certain dispute resolution bodies which the Income Tax Act had introduced in the form of, you could say, AARs, in the form of perhaps a dispute resolution panel or maybe a settlement commission. The appeals or the applications in front of these forums was supposed to be adjudicated in a time-bound manner. That was emphasized by the TARC committee as well. Now, coming back to the issue of retrospectivity. Retrospectivity is not something which is just an India-centric problem. And for a taxpayer, it is a nightmarish experience because, of course, you have to go back in time, you have to comply accordingly in time, you have to, your assessments would reopen. And of course, it's a very troublesome and burdensome process. As I'm saying, it's not just an India-centric issue. In the European Union, I'll give you a contemporary. In the European Union, the concept of retrospective amendments is not entirely abolished. In fact, they also follow a principle that so long as retrospective amendments are just addressing abuse, they are fine in nature. Okay, they can be tolerated. So they have at least limited the scope of retrospectivity as far as the European jurisdiction is concerned. In the Indian context, because of the retrospective amendments which did happen, there were certain ramifications, some of which I'll talk about towards the conclusion. But one of which is very interesting is that in the form of certain constitutional challenges which were brought in front of the Supreme Court as far as the government's power to retrospectively amend income tax laws are concerned, especially the charging provisions. McLeod Russell, which is one of the leading, I would say, tea cultivators in India or tea producers in India, they were the first ones to bring in this constitutional challenge. This was in 2012. Then it was followed by Saab Miller Group. Then it was followed by Kane India Group. So all in all these matters, though they are sub judice right now, but in India, we have already started seeing a trend where there is a challenge to such sort of retrospective power which the government holds at the moment. Okay? Now, moving beyond this, what are the sort of recourses which the taxpayer has now in the contemporary times, and especially given the sort of times which we have witnessed as far as income tax landscape is concerned in the pre-independence era? We definitely have come a long way. We definitely stand in a position, we definitely stand in a zone where a lot of taxpayer favorable terms, treatments, applications, and you would say scenarios are present. Having said that, it's not that the challenges have been eliminated altogether, but let me first talk about some of the major uh, reliefs which have been granted in favor of the taxpayer. Now, in India, we do not have a dedicated code for the protection of taxpayer rights. Instead, we have a citizens charter, which the income tax department has, the latest edition of which is the 2014 edition, where certain guidelines are mentioned. Why I'm calling them guidelines? Because they are legally not enforceable. So some of these provisions, they are pointing towards the rights which a taxpayer enjoys, and some of these provisions, they are pointing towards the obligations which a taxpayer has. Now, this is a basic principle of law that every right has a corresponding obligation, right? But at the same time, we should also keep in mind that for an issue like tax, where it has been traditionally perceived as a burden, where tax has been perceived as an obligatory payment towards the state, for every obligation, there should be certain corresponding rights as well. So we have to read the situation slightly different in a vice versa manner, and which is where now it's important to understand that what sort of rights we have started enjoying. Needless to say, a lot of improvements since the time of, I would say, the British era. Particularly, we have constitutional protection, we have administrative law protection, we also have certain statutory provisions which are there in the Income Tax Act, in the IT Act, maybe certain other statutes as well. But at the same time, my point is that even though there is no codified structure as far as the rights of taxpayers are concerned, we do have certain enforcements in favor of the in favor of the taxpayers as far as their rights are concerned. In the constitutional sense, I'll give you an example of the writ jurisdiction which is there, Article 32, Article 226, also the SLP jurisdiction which is there, Article 136. Now, generally, the rule with respect to writ jurisdictions is that as long as any other relief is available and that relief has not been exhausted, one should not directly approach the writ mechanism. But a savior in favor of the taxpayer, is, or sort of, I would say, relief in favor of the taxpayer is that if, in the opinion of the concerned courts, Article 32, Article 226, if in the opinions of the concerned court, if you are able to establish that the mechanism which is available is not efficacious, then definitely you can approach even while other mechanisms might be approachable or might be available. So writ mechanism is one of the strong, I would say, suits which a taxpayer has. That aside, there are certain other bodies, administrative quasi-judicial bodies, which have been constituted. As far as administrative bodies are concerned, we have a settlement commission, we have a dispute resolution panel. As far as quasi-judicial bodies are concerned, we have authority for advance ruling. Uh, Examples of administrative actions in favor of taxpayers could also be read in cases of the APA arrangements, advanced pricing agreements, as far as transfer pricing issues are concerned. And of course, they are available as far as double taxation avoidance agreements are also concerned, because we have a MAP arrangement over there, the mutual agreement procedure arrangement, where competent authorities of the concerned jurisdictions, they can sit together, they can discuss over, they can ponder over the issues of the taxpayers which have been brought to their notice. But despite all these, I would say, mechanisms which are in place now, despite the move from enforcement-based to service-based culture, which the income tax department has depicted in the last couple of decades, we still are far from a zone where we can say that we are living in times of tax certainty. We might have laws which are fair in nature, but still the issue of certainty is a sort of hanging sword, which is perennially there as far as taxpayers are concerned. With respect to certain provisions, the issue of certainty is definitely there, but with respect to some of the provisions, there is still uncertainty as far as procedural delays, as far as assessment-based functions, as far as, I would say, adjudication delays, all these are concerned. So which is where life of taxpayer in the contemporary era, though it is easier than before, but at the same time, there are certain major issues which the taxpayer faces even now. For example, the recently introduced GAR norms, which again, as per the Shroom Committee's recommendation, were sort of deferred for a period of 3 years. In fact, 3 to 4 years, I would say. And when then finally they were introduced in 2017, there was a particular section which was troublesome, which was particularly gruesome for the interest of a taxpayer. Now, the concept of GAR, the General Anti-Avoidance Rules in India, focuses around the idea of impermissible avoidance arrangement, which is embedded in Section 96 of the Act. But which is where Section 96 subclause 2 is troublesome, because we have moved from the principles of presumption of innocence to presumption of guilt. As per Section 96(2) provision, even if a tax benefit, a tax mitigation exercise is ancillary in nature, it will be assumed that the taxpayer had entered into such an arrangement with the sole objective of getting a tax benefit. Now, this is a very troublesome arena because, of course, the presumption of guilt has come into play, and the onus is on the taxpayer every single time to prove, to establish that whatever benefit he or she or the organization has arrived at is incidental in nature, is purely incidental in nature. It's not something which was planned. Now, this seems to be slightly, in contradiction to the Westminster principle as well. Though the Westminster principle has been very thoroughly abused in time, but at the same time, I would say Westminster principle still holds ground, and it should not be discarded entirely. So which is where, in my reading, the General Anti-Avoidance Rules, Section 96(2) is troublesome, and it is against the nature of Westminster principle. Some more quick inputs as far as the probable issues which might be there in the domain of taxpayer rights, and the probable, or I would say the actual sort of measures which the income tax department has in place to, if not cater these issues specifically, but overall interest of taxpayer rights. You might have heard of digital taxation. It's making a lot of news these days. Right from 1st of April 2020 onwards, there is a new tax which has been introduced on digital service providers in India, where a 2% flat levy has been introduced on them because the services are being rendered in the territory of India, despite the fact that the payments, the collection of income might be happening in certain other territories. Now, this is where, I mean, it becomes a particularly troublesome zone for international players, particularly the streaming services or online content services, Netflix, certain other platforms, Amazon Prime, which might be streaming in India, but at the same time, I mean, they might be delivering services in India, but the income collection might be happening elsewhere. In case of Google, Facebook, who might be having some sort of, I mean, revenue generation from the Indian territory because of service provision, they might have already paid their fair share of taxes in the US. They might have already paid their share of taxes as far as their subsidiaries are concerned in the Indian territory. But at the same time, they'll also be facing this particular digital tax levy. So the point is, this digital taxation is a new domain altogether. Uh, in the BEPS Action Plan 2015 scenario, uh, the digital space was Action Plan 1. The digital era was part of Action Plan 1. And at the same time, I mean, since enough coherence, I would say, has not been arrived at right now, uh, individual states, they have started imposing taxes on digital transactions already. India is also a part of that particular exercise. So that's one another major probable trouble zone which is there in the contemporary times. So what I'm trying to tell you is that irrespective of the fact that how much the administration tries to improve the setup, there will be issues, there will be challenges because of the very nature of the Income Tax Act, because of the very nature of taxation laws. It's very dynamic in nature. It changes with time very quickly, and because of which, of course, there will be changes, there will be challenges every now and then. Now, to conclude, there are certain, I would say, major actions in favor of the taxpayer also, which have been conducted, which have been undertaken as an exercise by the Income Tax Department or the government, you could say. There is a centralized public grievance redressal and monitoring system which has been put into place, where it's a huge departure from how the system used to be. To give you an example how the system used to be, we had a provision or we had an establishment named as the Ombudsman mechanism, which was introduced somewhere around 2010. But it was an exercise which had to be conducted in person. You had to approach the forum in person as a taxpayer. You had to address the forum with your grievances. And then, of course, I mean, it was mostly a time-taking process, a lot of administrative challenges which were there. Most of the times, the members, the quorum of the ombudsman, that would not be full, that would not be complete, and because of which proceedings could not be undertaken. So all of these, they were outdated techniques which started being noticed. And because of which, now this centralized mechanism, public grievance mechanism that has been introduced, that's an entirely digital space which is in place. It's part of the e-Nivaran exercise which the government has undertaken now, where technology has been brought in to facilitate the tax collection, tax administration, and also the issues and grievance redressal of taxpayers. Okay. So, in the same light, the latest, I would say, major development which has happened in context of income taxes is in the form of e-assessment. Now, last year it was introduced as a mechanism, and e-assessment, though it might appear to be a little ambitious at the current point of time or the given point of time because of the sheer mass of population which we have, but the ultimate objective is to increase the tax base and to facilitate the cause of taxpayers as much as possible. Now, keeping all these in mind, as I said, we have come a far way from where taxpayer rights they stood and where we stand now. Even now, we do not have, I would say, a comprehensive structure, an absolute structure as far as the protection of taxpayer rights in India is concerned. But at the same time, we are moving in the right direction. I can definitely say that because the process is more and more consultative now. The amendments which are brought into, of course, at times the industry bodies, the taxpayers, they might be surprised by government actions. But their concerns are duly considered. So that scope is definitely now in place. The redressal mechanisms, they are better in shape. Time-bound redressal mechanisms, they have come into effect, though the time-bound or the limitation, or I should say, the period in which they are supposed to adjudicate, it still is not totally enforceable because of the sheer volume of cases which might be there in the Indian context. So some delays, they are definitely there. But with the advent of technology, with the amalgamation of technology, some amalgamation of even, I would say, big data, uh, the assessment functions, they'll be fairer. And of course, if the assessment functions, they are fairer, at the end of the day, there will be lesser disputes. And to conclude, as far as a solid structure of taxpayer rights is concerned, it's not merely about dispute resolution, which is where we can also say that arbitration can be introduced, which is where we can say that there are other possibilities of mediation, conciliation, whatnot. A solid taxpayer rights structure should ideally have a mechanism which does not let the taxpayer go to the dispute level. The issues, they have to be addressed. The issues, they should not be there simply because the structure of the act is well laid. The structure of the act is simplistic. The structure of the act is, or the provisions is clear in nature, and it's not an uphill task for the taxpayer to comprehend them. In which direction we have already taken a step. The draft direct tax code, which was, I would say, I mean, supposed to be implemented at the beginning of 2021. Let's see now when it, gets implemented, when it sees the light of the day. The new direct tax code is definitely going to simplify most of the issues, most of the provisions which the industry, which the taxpayers are facing at the moment. So with this, I conclude, and I would definitely like to take some questions from you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for such an enlightening session. So we have a lot of questions from the attendees. So the first question I would like to ask is from Vijender Singh Kushwaha. He says, what will be the current strategy for taxpayer after COVID-19?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question actually, because we all are facing this situation right now. You might have noticed in news that as far as uh, the return filing dates are concerned, as far as certain assessment based issues are concerned, there are already extensions which have been granted from the side of the ministry, which have been granted from the side of the government. Now, you may have heard of, though my emphasis was on direct taxes, you may have heard of, I mean, in sections of media, there are demands that GST should be waived for a particular period of time, which the government might be mulling. I'm not, sort of predicting anything, but at the same time, given the sort of economic scenario which we are in, definitely these are the immediate reliefs, the immediate measures which the government can consider, the government can grant in favor of the taxpayers. In context of COVID-19, like I'll give you a specific example of direct taxes. There is an issue, or there is there is a of Income Tax Act, which is known as transfer pricing. Under transfer pricing, there is a concept of arm's length price, which simply said means that whenever there are related parties interacting with each other, commercially interacting with each other, which is not forbidden by any law, the only limitation is that such an interaction has to happen at a fair market price. Okay, it has to happen at a fair value. Now, needless to say, in the COVID times, the government will be considerate, it has to be considerate of the market scenarios, because the prices, the considerations between different contractual parties, they will get affected, they will get changed. And because of which the government is definitely going to be considerate of these factors.
Thank you, Professor. So the next question is from Sahitya, and the question is that she's interested in taxation law specialization as an LLM course, and she's asking whether which course would be more suitable as onto the resume. Will it be better to have a LLM in taxation or LLM in a business corporate law?
I think either could be considered. I mean, that's slightly, an open-ended answer, but at the same time, you really need to assess your interests. If you're inclined towards learning on the managerial side of things as well, if you're inclined towards learning on maybe the bulk of, I would say, company law matters, IP law matters, definitely you can go for a business law LLM. But at the same time, a taxation LLM is definitely something which is going to be more specialized, and it's going to be more focused on issues of taxation, direct taxes, indirect taxes, international taxation. International taxation has emerged as a huge domain in. And let me clarify, international taxation is not referring to any, I would say, code of laws, jurisdictions all the sovereigns refer to. It's simply the domestic tax provisions which are applicable in case of international transactions. So my point is, if you really want to expertise in taxation, then you can definitely choose LLM in taxation. But if you want to have a holistic understanding of how the corporate world functions, where there is an amalgamation of corporate laws, intellectual property, some other business laws, and then at the same time taxation laws as well, then definitely you can go for a LLM in business laws.
Thank you, Professor. So the next question is from Rahul, and he says, can you please shed some light on the idea of inheritance tax and wealth tax in India, given the wide economic disparity in India and the need to generate additional revenue?
All right. So in the same light, when you have asked about inheritance tax, wealth tax, the wide income, you would say inequality, which is there. Let me also bring in the same category the issue of agriculture-based taxation, right? And that is something which I had addressed at the very beginning of the lecture. Agriculture-based taxation, that is something which almost all major economists of India have been saying, propagating as an idea for it to be taxed. But of course, because of certain political reasons, it cannot be, or it is not being taxed at the moment. Simply said, the expansion of tax base, it can be achieved if we at least end up taxing high yielding farmers or high revenue farmers, okay, high net worth farmers. Of course, there can be certain brackets over there, certain slabs over there, and the same concept can apply in case of inheritance tax as well. A similar concept is already available in case of wealth taxes. Wealth tax do now stand abolished because they have been integrated in the Income Tax Act itself. Certain assets which you are holding become taxable. Certain assets, like at least if you have just one residential house unit, for example. So my point is simply based on the might, appropriate amount of taxation schemes can be introduced so that tax base can be increased and this income divide or income, I would say, lack of equal distribution that can be plugged in.
And thank you for the answer, Professor. So the next question is from Pragya, and she says, the Finance Act 2020 inserted amendment to Section 90 and 90A, clearly broadening the scope of the central government to enter into agreements with foreign countries. This move has been hailed as a step for anti-abuse provision. How do you think in a particular aspect like these amendments, taxpayer rights and anti-abuse provisions can be balanced? Thank you.
All right. Pragya, I would say that if you're aware of the MLI provisions which are there, and also if you have a background of what exactly happened after 2016, because of the treaty shopping which was happening, especially in context of the Indian DTAs which were there, there were certain treaty renegotiations which were already, introduced. And now with these set of amendments, the emphasis is to sort of line up the existing DTAs, and not just the existing DTAs, but the new ones which will be addressed, which will be entered into. The emphasis is to line them up in accordance with the general anti-avoidance rules which we have in India at the moment. Okay, so in my talk, I mentioned that one of the issues is that of principle of guilt rather than principle of innocence, right? So that principle of guilt is going to be given effect in international agreements as well now, so that treaty shopping is plugged to some extent. Might seem arbitrary at the moment, but that's where the government seems to be moving in that particular direction.
Professor. The next question is Vijay Lakshmi Raju, and he says, would you please let us know about the direct tax code and the importance in the present era?
Of course. See, I tried to give you some background into how many income tax statutes we had between 1860 to 1947, I should say. I did skip a few, major, or I shouldn't say major, a few of the enactments which are there. But since 1961, what has been happening is there is no comprehensive review of the act which is done in a consolidated manner. It's only on a piecemeal basis. We have had several amendments through different finance acts, and because of which the entire read of Income Tax Act is very cumbersome today. Though we just have, I would say, roughly 298 sections in the Income Tax Act, but along with the different finance acts which have compiled, which have been put together with a period of time since 1961, it has become a very bulky read, and at times there are interpretational issues as well. To resolve all these situations, to simplify the wordings, and that's the most important part, to simplify the wordings so that a common man can have understanding, can have comprehension of how income tax can be read, is the objective of the direct taxes code. Also, one major importance of having the new direct tax code is, again, in lines or in compliance with the BEPS norms, with the BEPS recommendations, I would say the action plan recommendations, the MLI recommendations, we are trying to bring in more and more international best practices in our own statute. Take, for example, the issue of tax information exchange. That is something which will be made part of the Income Tax Act itself now.
Thank you, Professor. So the next question is from Parsava, and he asks that, is the super rich tax on income a substitute for tax on wealth?
No, not exactly. That's the sort of issue over there, because I did tell you I will be touching upon it towards the conclusion of the lecture. And thank you for bringing this question up. I told you super rich tax was for the first time introduced in the era of World War, because First World War to be specific, because the government, the erstwhile government, was falling short of revenues, right? Even now, if you would carefully study the structure, the slabs which are there for income taxation in India, the moment you are earning more than 50 lakh rupees per annum, there is a super rich tax which is imposed on you, irrespective of the assets which you possess, irrespective of the wealth which you possess. So, to clarify, wealth tax will come into operation, or wealth tax can be imposed only if you have certain assets. But super rich tax will come into operation the moment you have certain income, right? So the moment you have an income beyond 50 lakh rupees, it's a revenue generation scheme for the government, extra revenues which can be generated.
So for the answer. So the next question is from Sahitya, and she wants to know, what are the must-read judgments for the taxation law?
That's a very good question. Instead of, I would say, the must-read judgments, because there are a lot of judgments which are important. I mean, I can of course offer you a list. I can provide you a list. Anshu, if you can kindly share my email address with all the participants, then I can definitely share it with you over mail. But one tip which I can give you in that direction is start following certain blogs, certain taxation blogs. Like one of them which is particularly good is Tax Sutra. Just go to Tax Sutra, start reading about certain basic tax issues which you may have heard of, or certain terms. Start with that. For example, the concept of tax base. Just search over there what exactly the notion of tax base is. You will find some very interesting articles, including judgments. If you may have heard of, for example, the permanent establishment concept, PE concept, just key in the words PE over there, permanent establishment over there, and then definitely you'll find certain important judgments, certain readings. And that's the ideal approach which I would recommend. But if you need specific list of cases, as I mentioned, please drop me a mail. I'll provide you certain.
Yeah. So, Professor, the next question is from Paritosh, and he says that given the power with department for reassessment and non-application of res judicata, to what extent does the rights of the assessees are actually given value?
Well, the rights of the assessee, they still hold good, because I gave you as, even if the power of reassessment is there in the hands of the assessing officer, it can be appealed against. It can be first, taken up at the CIT level, and then after the CIT level, it can be taken up at the ITAT level. So the income tax department, it does have a robust mechanism in place. Now, the actual issue, the ground reality which is there is, of course, there is a legal mechanism in place. After the ITAT level, you can approach the concerned High Court and then the Supreme Court as well. But the real issue is that of time. Time is a currency in the contemporary, era, where for businesses particularly, more than money which is locked up, it is the time which goes into judicial delays. And that's something which we are struggling uniformly, not just in the domain of taxation, but almost all other domains as well in India. So yes, in that context, the taxpayer rights, they do get hampered. But as far as the mechanism being in place is concerned, we definitely have a mechanism. There are checks and balances. It's, I would say, majorly the implementation issues which are definitely there even now.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. So we have the last question for the session today, and the question is, how will the taxpayer rights protected in the post-COVID-19 era?
How
Professor, can you hear me? The question is, how are the taxpayer rights going to be protected post-COVID era?
Yeah, I think this question was asked earlier as well. So just very quickly, I'll recap on it that I gave you the example of transfer pricing. As you know, as an illustration, you can take the concept of transfer pricing, where associated enterprises or related parties, they can transact with each other, no sort of embargoes on it, but at the same time, definitely some sort of a fair market price has to be exercised as far as the considerations are concerned. Now, in the same context, as far as the COVID times are concerned, the economy in COVID is concerned, the market prices are definitely going to be affected. The market prices will change, and the government is going to be considerate of it. There are already indications that the formula which is used, or the mechanism which is used for TP calculations, transfer pricing calculations, there will be some relaxations over there, some sort of compliance relaxations, certain tax-based relaxations, certain time extensions, in the form of, like, you can already see that assessment dates, filing dates, they have been extended. So a lot of, I would say, sort of a scrutiny is on at the moment. A lot of, I mean, assessment is on at the moment, that how exactly the government needs to respond to the COVID situation.
Thank you so much, Professor. With this, we come to an end with our webinar. Professor, I would request if you want to give an end note to all the attendees regarding the seminar about the topic or in general.
All right, so I hope I was able to answer all your queries, and I hope this was informative. If you need more information on the idea of taxpayer rights, it's a novel domain, let me tell you that, in India. It's a domain which has been researched a lot upon in the United States, in the European Union, particularly in the European Union, because they have a very robust mechanism of rights, right? I mean, it could be human rights, it could be taxpayer rights, and in fact, over there, taxpayer rights, they now are also read in conjugation with human rights. We are yet to arrive there, because trust me, tax is an issue which is affecting each and every one of us, and because of which there needs to be certain concrete mechanisms in the form of reliefs, if at all there are certain abuses not just in the hands of taxpayers, but abuses in the hands of tax administrators as well. Okay, so which is where a proper check and balance mechanism needs to be constituted. If you need to have certain readings on it, or if you need to know more about the subject, there is already I would say, a tremendous exercise which is being undertaken by IBFT, which is International Bureau for Fiscal Documentation, one of the leading tax research organizations set up in 1930s. Uh, this IBFT, what it does is, as an organization, now they have come up with an Observatory for Protection of Taxpayers' Rights, known as OPTR. Observatory for Protection of Taxpayer Rights. We can simply access the content which is available at OPTR. It's open access, open source, will give you the status of taxpayer rights in different jurisdictions. They come up with an year-on-year report. 2019 report is delayed because of COVID, but 2018 report is equally, I would say, informative and important. So you can definitely start reading that. I have also written an article on taxpayers' rights, and probably that's the reason why I was asked to speak on this topic. So it's on Liverpool Law Review. If any of you are law students, you can definitely this particular article. It's in the same name, Jurisprudence of Taxpayer Rights, an evolutionary tale in the context of direct taxes in India. So that's where you'll see that how exactly from point one, from the word go, which is 1860, our first income tax act, till date, where we stand. The article is much in detail. Of course, I cannot cover much of it in half an hour, but then you'll see a lot of concepts I've tried to bring in over there. So that's also a good read, which you can undertake for the purpose of taxpayer rights.
Thank you so much, Professor, for answering all the queries and being with us today. Thank you for joining us. And I would also thank all the attendees for joining us today for this webinar. If you have any queries, I've shared Professor's email ID with you. You can directly ask him any questions or any readings which you want. Thank you so much for attending. Stay safe, stay home. I hope to see you soon again. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.